They used to be the cheapest meals on the table. Now they're served on silver platters for a fortune. From once hated veggies to dishes that screamed poverty but now ooze luxury, these foods pulled off the ultimate glow-up. Stick around because this one's going to surprise you. So we're going to start our list with bone marrow, which is honestly the most classic example of something going from peasant food to actually being a high-end delicacy fit for royalty. See, for most of our known history, marrow was just the byproduct of a good day at the butcher's shop. It wasn't special, it wasn't rare, and it definitely wasn't hard to catch or exotic. These were usually the things that would get you a good reputation, enough of one to end up on some bigwig's table, but bone marrow got the opposite end of the spectrum. And since butcher shops enjoyed the better part of a century as the top dogs, bone marrow was pretty abundant. Then you had all these people living in shanty towns and rural tribes and whatnot constantly swearing by it, and it really just created this warped view on the whole thing in urban areas. In the 19th and 20th century America, it was so common to see bone marrow stew everywhere you went, especially throughout the wars and the Depression. A few people towards the end of the 20th century helped flip the script, and one such name was Fergus Henderson, who helped bring bone marrow back to the scene with his roasted bone marrow recipe. American chefs who were fond of nose-to-tail cooking like Anthony Bourdain also helped popularize bone marrow dishes that were fit for any table. All that exclusiveness and attention obviously created demand, which obviously created price hikes, which obviously created more hype, and that's pretty much how we ended where we are. Lobster was something that was so abundant in New England during colonial America times that they would honestly just wash up on the shore. And I'm not really talking about a few lobsters, a little nice gang of them. I'm talking about a massive lobster pile. I mean, most people were tired of the damn thing. They had no idea how to spice it up or what else to do with it. That's how common lobster used to be. They were abundant, they were cheap, not special at all, and just the exact most extreme opposite you can imagine from where they are today. Hell, farmers used crushed lobster shells for fertilizer. That is the state we are talking about today. It also never got a chance to make a big, bright name for itself because lobster was always geographically locked to the coastal cities, so people who lived far away just didn't have it. That is until canning came around. Now, canning made lobster a lot more accessible, to the point it became a shelf stable. And then came railroads in the 1800s that meant that people were able to trade lobster with inland cities like New York. And of course, the rich saw a new toy, and this was one they could dress up all pretty and everything too. Sourdough actually has been through the ringer a few times. So it started out being the preferred bread, but it went through a decline over the 1900s thanks to industrialized bread and commercial yeast taking over. Fast-acting yeast was so accessible, and it meant that not only was bread making a lot easier and a lot quicker thanks to this, but that wasn't all. One of the biggest benefits of industrialized bread making was that they got the formula on lock. With sourdough, you had like 7 loaves out of 10 on a good day that would be sellable. With industrialized baking, all of them were ready to be sat on a shelf. Now, the artisans wouldn't really take this just laying down, right? No, they decide if the opponent is doubling down, so will they. They brought back artisan baking in the 1980s and 1990s with a really creative spin that was focusing on how artisan bread is rustic, personalized, authentic, and how you can get a bread experience you will never find on the shelves of any store in America. San Francisco was one of the hubs for this boom. They had a place called Boudin there that became famous for bringing back San Francisco-style sourdough. They successfully rebranded it as this artistic bread that's for real lovers, and that drew a lot of people back in, rich and otherwise. Collard greens have been a peasant food for many reasons and for a long time. They were really popular in African American culture for sharecroppers, small farmsteads, rural villages, and more. A lot of people relied on them for centuries, but their reputation was always that of low-class food. Towards the 20th century, collard greens began to gain some respect as a symbol of the South and its humble, rustic cuisine. Now, what I like to think is that this dish was in the right place at the right time. See, towards the end of the 20th century, there was a massive health scare going around all of America, particularly the South. What can I say? Years of drippings, bacon, lard, fat, and deep frying things in oil or beer or both may do that to you. Collard greens began a light that people were flocking to, full moth style. People were familiar enough with them, had an acquired taste for them too, and liked all the different spins you could throw on the dish. So for a lot of people, they were the first step towards a healthier lifestyle. And that's really why they did a complete 180. There are only a few specific cuts of the cow that are really prized in value. Brisket doesn't happen to be one of them. It comes from the chest, and that's full of really tough muscle and really chewy connective tissue. Meaning that historically, this was a meat eater's last resort, or one of them. Now, braising brisket helped make it tender, but a lot of people thought it was just too much effort for not enough buck. I can't really explain how the next 10 seconds happened historically because sometimes these trends just explode, but I can narrate it all to you. After the people were over braising it, Texas ranchers and Mexican cowboys began smoking brisket, and barbecue joints all over Texas took note and tried their own spin by smoking it for hours on wood. Texas slowly became known for this, and after World War II, it became a full-blown Texas barbecue Hall of Famer. You had people in Austin, Lockhart, and Houston going balls to the wall insane over the delicious taste of this, upper, middle, and lower class alike. The barbecue joints didn't really miss out on that. They raised their prices accordingly, and brisket actually happened to triple or quadruple in markets. This used to be a bargain meat you would try your best to get rid of, and it actually became the reason why a lot of butchers' families got to eat good meat later on. You know, out of everything here, sardines probably have the richest history. They've been something consumed all over the world, and people have been eating it since way before this place was called America. Sardines have been a food that people have always associated with just a bad day. You don't have anything to eat? You get sardines. You can't spend money on something good? You get sardines. Do you need to stretch the budget over a month or a tough week? Sardines. You get the point. Anyway, it takes a lot for a fish like that to turn its luck around, but this little soldier has done exactly that. While in ancient times it was just a cheap protein source, in the 19th and 20th centuries, sardines began to take off. You know, trade and all really spiked up thanks to all those nifty machines people started making. Eventually, we made our way to mass-produced canning, and that meant sardines are now just as available as your local gluten-free cereal. Being cheap as ever, that meant they were now a reliable option for a much bigger crowd. See, up until now, the most common consumers of sardines were just local fishing communities, hamlets, and villages. It wasn't until it got to the big cities that people started finding out you can do a lot more with sardines than just grilling or salting them, and from there on, it started to become a common ingredient in salads, rice-based meals, and other healthy food because of how nutritious it is. Talk about reinventing yourself. Offal had almost a one-to-one copy of bone marrow's experience. It was offal that was considered peasant food since way before any of our recent centuries, like this thing goes as far back as sardines do. Organ meats have never really been popular in any part of America, historically speaking, not until recently. But how did we get here? Well, a lot of chefs had a hand in helping people be more open to the benefits of nose-to-tail eating. If you aren't familiar with the term, it just means to not waste any part of the animal, from the nose right down to the tail. They wouldn't just serve it up in a gamey, metallic-tasting stew, though. They'd give proper recipes with sides and dips accompanying the offal dish, bringing out the best in. Plus, besides just high-end restaurants and an appreciation for different kinds of food growing among the American people, it kind of got popular with the foodies. Lots of high-end restaurants started using liver mousses, braised hearts, or roasted bone marrow in their dishes. It's a whole thing. Quinoa is really something we've gotten used to, haven't we? But it didn't always used to be that way. Quinoa was actually a staple crop of the indigenous Andean farmers way back in the day. It's cool the way things end up traveling half the globe before they end up in our bowls and on our plates, huh? But it got to us by the time the Spanish got here, and while they weren't really too fond of quinoa, all the small indigenous farming communities did still keep planting it. Even throughout the 1900s, it was mostly seen as a poor man's crop and wasn't looked upon too favorably. This was its luck for much of the remainder and the next century, Until in the 1990s, as research into different kinds of food developed, it became known that quinoa was actually very rich in protein. It also helped that it wasn't a grain, but it could be used like one. A best of both worlds situation, really. Ever since then, vegetarians, healthy food bloggers, and gym bros have unitedly pushed for how much more of this we need in our diets. I think it's taken off, since it's now considered a pretty luxury health product. It's even a lot pricier now. Duck fat might be an odd one to you because what would people need to be doing with that, right? But, well, before refrigeration, different kinds of fats made up a big part of people's preservation methods. This was true in America up until the 1900s, when industrialization basically meant that there were just better ways of preserving things like canning, even if refrigeration hadn't come around yet. When it did, people just thought to do away with it entirely, since it became redundant. In the 2000s, though, there was a bit of a resurgence of interest in a lot of America's food circles, thanks to chefs like Thomas Keller. High restaurants and farm-to-table places that had become local names were rendering duck fat on their own as a part of their marketing, too. It added to the air of exclusiveness, and duck fat was something that people were also beginning to argue was better than either butter or lard. Something about it having more monounsaturated fats. Either way, if you know the science about it, please do share in the comments. But that's pretty much how duck fat started to turn itself around and become a popular cooking fat once again. And I got to say, that's pretty humble. It stuck to its roots the whole time. Chitlins have a longer history than you might think. They were originally a survival food for poor people, right? Especially in the American South. Now it's exactly those roots that tied it so strongly to its community. People had been relying on this for years, and they had honestly come to be too familiar with it, especially in African American communities. In West Africa even, you have lots of dishes that involve offal meat. But chitlins weren't out of their initial image just yet. They were still considered a poor man's food, and in truth, that is what they were. Even in the late 1800s, it was really just sharecroppers and southern farmers that had these. It wasn't until the early 20th century that chitlins had become rooted the way I was talking about. They were still largely popular in just the South, but it was things like the chitlin circuit where legends like Aretha Franklin and B.B. King's were known to perform and help turn them into a common food. I mean, the circuit was known for having chitlins on hand all the time. Despite that, they still were considered a low-class food mostly because of the way it would take hours to cook and clean it to remove the smell. That part really put a lot of people off of it. Recently, though, in the 2000s, a lot of soul food restaurants have tried to reinvent it and have started offering chitlins served in really premium ways, doubling down on the cultural attachment while bringing culinary finesse. Polenta has pretty much always been considered gruel food. It's made from boiled cornmeal and is something even Italian immigrants and Italian Americans consider to be a low-status dish. It was a recipe that was born out of necessity, but recently, lots of high-end restaurants and chefs have embraced it and appreciated it for how creamy it is and the versatility of the overall recipe. In the 1900s, most people were moving away from polenta because they were just more fond of bread and pasta. They were considered simpler, cleaner, and just overall more nice. Lots of Italians also shared the opinion, so there was really no one in polenta's corner. Until the middle of the 1900s. Sometimes you pull yourself out of your own rut, and that's what polenta did. The middle of the 20th century was a time marked by a lot of things, one of them being tourism, and one of the top countries for it was Italy. So many Italicans were visiting, and polenta, capitalizing on that via lots of high-end chefs reinventing it, serving it with things eel truffle oil and seafood, became a bit of a regional specialty. Look, even if it has turned into a luxury dish today, I'm still not eating snails. Sorry, escargot. Funnily enough, a lot of people used to think that way. So how exactly do snails go from being an insult your third-grade teacher slings at you to something you pay $100 and above at some restaurants when you're out on a special date? The thing is, escargot was something that people had typically begun to eat in the Depression out of necessity. Since there was nothing around, people had really took to exploring what Mother Nature had to offer. What they found out was that snails actually weren't so bad in a pickle, but that didn't mean they wanted to keep the habit long-term. until French restaurants in the middle of the 20th century began to popularize the dish once again. Now, escargot started to become something of a premium, a fine dining dish associated with Parisian restaurant culture, and all the white wine it came with didn't help that at all. Octopus is actually one I bet you've never really heard about before. Octopus used to be considered a food that was pretty much a last resort. It was something that coastal peasants and fishermen ate when they had literally nothing else. It started to turn into a delicacy thanks to Japanese sushi and Italian seafood dishes. But man, it was really underrated. Octopus was considered super difficult to cook. You had to either dry it or pound it or slow simmer it, and it was really rubbery. The texture was foreign to a lot of people, so that's why they only ate it when there was nothing else. And naturally, if that's all you do, then that's the association you build. It became synonymous with bad times. It wasn't until lots of restaurants started doing things like pulpo a la gallega, which is a popular Spanish dish, and things like takoyaki and reductions that octopus started to gain respect in gourmet circles. The pork belly we've come to know is stuff like hongshao-ryu and Korean grilled pork belly, which is pretty melt in your mouth and really delicious. It's funny to think this same thing used to be peasant food in not just the United States, but all the home countries of the dishes I just mentioned. It was a pretty scrappy cut, but it turned into a fine dining dish thanks to innovative techniques in preparing it, and lots of slow roasting and braising. Remember, there's nothing a good slow roast can't fix when you're dealing with a tough cut of meat that people usually don't work with. If you're really looking to get fancy with it, you can start to crisp the pork belly, and that really turns into a feast. Pork belly isn't the cheap scrap it's always been considered up until today. It's one thing that's actually a common sight on lots of fine dining menus across places like Vegas or Los Angeles even. Have you ever heard of a boutique food trend? It's apparently food that's small scale and niche, but innovative and unique, kind of like a local indie band nobody knows about. The early 2000s basically ensured that there was a massive rise in craft food, and that was in large part because of the health scare and the internet. I mean, you get the internet for the first time in your life, you'd want to start blogging everything too. A lot of us did just that, in fact. Plus, artisanal pickles started to be something you would always see at trendy restaurants, and also something you'd see for a bit of an unreasonable price at farmers markets. But don't let me discourage you from spending your money. They're now a premium product despite originally being considered cheap pickles you'd eat when there was nothing else around. This is going to be an interesting one. Over the course of your life, you've probably never lived in a time where caviar wasn't worth at least a week's paycheck. It's one of the world's most expensive delicacies now, but it actually used to be an everyday food for a lot of fishermen back in the day, especially Russian and Parisian ones. That's just some fishing history for you. For centuries, fishermen who had territory around the Caspian Sea or the Black Sea would always catch sturgeons. But unlike the rich people of today, they would catch it for the meat of the fish itself. They'd typically just throw away most of the eggs, and it wasn't until the 1800s and 1900s that caviar really started to become this luxury item. Despite that, though, they swelled up in popularity a little too much. There were massive overfishing concerns that led to some pretty strict regulations. Wild caviar is now pretty rare, but it's still every bit the status symbol you've come to perceive it as. I really don't get paid that much money for a bunch of fish babies, though. But that's just me. Hopefully you too. Now, fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkraut, as well as miso, had started out as these really innovative and practical solutions to help preserve food before refrigeration had become such a household concept. But once they had begun to be associated with a lot of poor communities and rural ones, they started to be shunned away. Before refrigeration, fermentation was a pretty necessary way to help store food for the winters in all sorts of countries, not just America. It was more or less the staple way to preserve things for a lot of rural communities and farmsteads. Fermented foods were overlooked in more urban areas because of the harsh scents and the peasant-like feel of it, but that was really just people being snobby. They've got the opposite image now. I mean, haven't you seen all those viral TikToks about homegrown fermented kimchi? Lots of modern science also backs up the various health benefits of fermented foods. Who knows? Maybe it's what you need too. Foraged mushrooms didn't always lining our burgers and topping our pizzas. For a majority of its history, it was really just something people ate when things were super bad. There was nothing to eat and people basically just had to forage for whatever they could. The most popular of this was the button mushroom, but they definitely tried to forage as much as they could. Now, despite this, mushrooms were still considered really low class. People had just begun to associate it with nothing but poverty and hard times. It wasn't until the middle and the later end of the 20th century that mushrooms started to become a classic topping you'd see on not just burgers and pizzas, but steaks, chicken dishes, sandwiches, and all kinds of soups and stews. Basically, it's a mushroom world, and we're just living in it now. A big part of this is how canned mushrooms became so accessible. Another reason is that an interest in European cuisine led to a massive boom in cream of soups and cream of mushroom soups. Share some of your favorite mushrooms with us right now in the comments. A lot of the reason that something ends up being considered rich is because people with money tend to really just value the different subtleties and nuances in their ingredients. Heirloom tomatoes were once considered a poor man's food, tasting different than how the usual ones did. This is what led to a lot of people just marking them off and thinking they're not really worth the time or money, but later on, this is exactly what made them rise to fame too. Plus, there was a practical reason. Heirloom tomatoes were grown with an emphasis on flavor, complexity, and just being a generally more pleasant experience with more depth when it came to flavor. Normal tomatoes were grown prioritizing their resistance to rot and disease. They were meant to last long and be sturdy. Farmers didn't really think much of how juicy they would be, how they would feel to touch, and the texture. Later on, towards the end of the 20th century, it was these exact reasons that caused heirloom tomatoes to start becoming more and more beloved among food circles in America. Now, they're considered a very premium ingredient. Coconut oil is more or less a common cooking fat that's been. This is true in North America too, but it was a lot more of a regional issue. The thing was a cheap fat that was considered okay for everyday use. Towards the 1950s, though, it really got too overused. In the 1950s, lots of people were discovering that saturated fats actually had a pretty strong link to heart disease. Coconut oil was almost 80% just saturated fats, so you can pretty much imagine what the discourse on this was like. Then, by the 1990s and the dawn of the 21st century, coconut oil had pretty much cemented itself as this super cheap and unhealthy fat. It was mostly used for movie theater popcorn and fast food frying, which really didn't help any negative connotations. Now, coconut oil managed to rebrand itself, and the entire gauntlet it ran was considered generational. See, by the 2000s, coconut oil was making an incredibly massive comeback thanks to new research that had started to come out. It was suggesting that coconut oil was actually helpful in promoting better brain function and boosting your metabolism, and gourmet dishes were really popping off, highlighting the benefits of alternative oils like vegetable and coconut oil. From there on, it's been sitting perfectly pretty as a go-to oil for a lot of people. Blue crab was a really common and affordable food for a lot of coastal communities. It has become a sought-after item in places like Maryland and Louisiana and the Carolinas. But how did it get here? Blue crab was considered an everyday coastal food that was abundant among fish markets and fishermen. You would go take a walk along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and all you would ever see is a seemingly endless supply of blue crab that would never really go down either. For a lot of working-class families, this was a staple protein that was really helping them get through the day, while also making sure they were meeting their nutrition needs. Now, the labor process here was really hard. It took a lot to make blue crab, and cracking blue crabs to get the different kinds of meat was really time-consuming. It meant that they were less desirable for other consumers who basically would prefer lobster or oysters, especially the rich kind. They were really cheap and they weren't ever given away in fishing towns. People made use of everything they could, mostly because they were so available, you know? While you would think that would mean that people would essentially always sell the excess fish, they would actually just stock up on it for winters and consume it. Blue crab started to become expensive thanks to the rise of commercial fishing and a lot of environmental work that had risen in the Chesapeake Bay. Blue crab populations were starting to decline really sharply, and it became a thing of national concern. That and the high labor cost meant that blue crab was starting to get really pricey. Wild rice has a vivid history. It used to be a vital survival crop for a lot of different native American tribes, but later it was dismissed by a lot of settlers. They thought it wasn't really worth the work and that there were better grains to start planting. Indigenous tribes like the Ojibwe and the Sioux felt differently though, as they had grown up depending on the grain. Now, it was not until the middle of the 20th century that food enthusiasts really started to discover the deep and rich flavor of wild rice. There was also the unique texture, and it being a tribe staple was basically helping with the exotic food reputation it was making for itself. Wild rice really does have a lot of decent benefits though. It's a lot higher in protein than any other kind of rice, and it's also something that works really well in gourmet soups, pilafs, and rice bowls. It became a huge part of farm-to-table cuisine, and wild rice was now commercially farmed instead of being harvested by hand. Basically, they gentrified the thing. Pumpkin seeds were considered a really cheap and leftover ingredient that was basically seen as a byproduct of pumpkin farming. In Mexico and the Americas, a lot of people used to eat pumpkin seeds for their nutritious benefits, but in early America, pumpkins were always grown for, well, the pumpkin, not the seed itself. The seed had two illustrious fates available to it, one of which was being thrown away to the local population of hogs and pigs, and the other was simply being discarded in the mud. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not really a satisfying ending to me, which is why I'm glad that they turned things around for themselves in the 1990s. Health-conscious consumers had really become a sizable chunk of the customer base in general, and they were beginning to rediscover pumpkin seeds for how high in protein they were, how full of healthy fats they were, and how the magnesium content in these was amazing. They were actually rebranded as a superfood, whether or not you can believe it. Seaweed. Would you ever really like seaweed? I think that they're considered edible only in cartoons, but honestly, I was wrong. Seaweed actually used to be a survival food for a lot of coastal communities, and it has been transformed as this affordable everyday food to something that's completely the opposite. In America, seaweed was typically used either by coastal communities as a food they would eat when they would have nothing else or a fertilizer. Sometimes people would use it for animal feed and as a thickening agent, but that was really just in the Depression. It was definitely something that was exclusively considered poor man's food, though. People had begun to make such strong associations between seaweed and famine diets that the image was really hard to shake off. It wasn't until after the Second World War had ended that sushi culture and Japanese cuisine in general started to really get popular in America and gain some steam. This is where nori, a seaweed dish that's pretty much a staple in the average Japanese diet, started to come in. This dish popularized how effective seaweed could be paired with the right ingredients and assembled the right way. Seaweed used to be something that was always considered a low-class meal for people who couldn't afford any better, but now it's considered a healthy food that has a lot of nutritional benefits and can be used for making some pretty cute dishes. Handmade butter used to be a really simple kitchen staple at home, and it started to be reborn as a gourmet product when people really got into the crafts and works aspect of it. See, people like things they made on their own. It gives them a chance to show off on Instagram, it gives them something to talk about with their friends, or it just becomes something cool to speak about on a date. You know, a cute and quirky little fact about yourself that helps break the ice. Besides that, there's also the authenticity and uniqueness of a completely 100% homegrown and homemade product. In a world full of preservatives, food dyes, artificial flavorings, and added vitamins and minerals, something that's actually just made out of the stuff God put on earth and nothing else is a relief. The revival of artisanal butter throughout the 2000s to today was really helpful in giving it a new image. High-end restaurants started serving cultured butters, and they even started putting hand-churned ones up for sale. There was a premium price you had to pay, but man, the suburban moms fell for it so bad. Once, $1 ensured your furry friend's belly was full, a simple reflection of pet care's humble beginnings. Fast forward, and the pet food aisle has transformed into a labyrinth of organic, grain-free, and gourmet options, each with a price tag that speaks volumes about the evolution of pet nutrition and owner awareness. This inflation mirrors a broader shift in societal attitudes towards pets as family members deserving of quality care and nutrition. It's revealing that today's pet food market not only caters to a variety of dietary needs, but also aligns with human food trends, emphasizing the interconnectedness of human and pet health in the family ecosystem. Speaking of how different things were in their time due to the economical strife, one thing that got really popular back when your grandparents were still young was sausage gravy and biscuits. This might seem like an outlandish combo to us today, and we admit it takes a bit of getting used to, but the magic is all in the gravy. Biscuits and gravy are already something Americans have been pretty accustomed to eating, especially in the 20th century, but innovation is one of the finer points of the country, and culinary matters are no exception. People eventually found out that using pork sausage crumbles enriched the gravy and made it irresistible, especially if they were smoked. Usually biscuits like jumbo buttermilk ones make for a great side to the dish, but even the gravy alone was worth eating on its own. We are still continuing the Meat Express because next on the list is Salisbury Steak. Dietitian James Salisbury invented the steaks to help out with increased digestive issues and illnesses that were spreading rapidly in the U.S. The now dinner staple, Salisbury steak, involved a hamburger patty and was mostly known to be a steak with high-quality beef and gravies. The healthy aspect was ensured by keeping the gravies homemade and the beef clean. The Salisbury steak started losing customers as illnesses started to decrease in the populace. As a result, lots of restaurants stopped serving it regularly. However, now it is returning. Whether that is due to digestive issues coming back with it or a growing love for the vintage, you can find this at American Steak much more commonly now. Rabbits aren't as common as they were back then, so rabbit pie has vanished from our tables and Easter traditions. You know what? All good things come to an end. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. $1 back then could enchant the minds of children with vibrant stories, acting as a foundational pillar for imagination and learning. These books, rich in moral and educational content, played a pivotal role in bedtime routines, creating lasting memories and learning moments. The current price range of $10 to $20 for children's books is indicative of significant enhancements in publishing, from richer illustrations to interactive elements, catering to a wide array of developmental needs. This shift not only mirrors inflation, but also a deeper societal commitment to diversity in storytelling and early literacy, emphasizing the crucial role of engaging literature in shaping young minds. Southern skillet cornbread has been a beloved memento of the South for many decades to the rest of the nation, but in the area, it is a tradition that goes back all the way to the 18th century. History books tell us that it comes from Native American cuisine, and it makes sense since a lot of Native American cuisine was very cost-effective. It is kind of everything you would want in a home-cooked meal, easy on the wallet, simple ingredients you can find at any nearby store, and little prep time, which means you can get your cravings fulfilled immediately. Plus, most cooks back then were so accustomed to it from a lifetime of making cornbread in these cast iron skillets that they could make it much faster than even an experienced cook. Guess experience counts for something, especially when you have 40 to 50 years of it. Remember Hormel? Connoisseurs of canned cuisine? They brought corned beef hash to the States in around the 1970s. This hearty breakfast dish has survived the tests of time as it would be discontinued then brought back almost instantaneously, until the beef hash found a permanent place in American cuisine. The food has ties to WW2 as it was a lot more popular back then to eat canned options or packaged food. Beef hash was particularly well liked because meat was hard to come by at the time. Fresh meat in particular was always rationed immediately. This made Hormel products a must-buy for people back in the day. While hash has been around in America for even longer, it became really popular in the 40s. Though in the post-war era, it did fall off in popularity, urging the company to discontinue the product. Beef hash made a comeback in the 70s when inflation hit, as people were looking for cheaper alternatives. Since then, this dish has slowly been making a return to many restaurants these days, especially as a cheap takeout option. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse, and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. In the golden age of analog, $1 could breathe life into typewriters across America, keeping the gears of communication and creativity turning. Now, the niche pursuit of typewriting, with its ribbons considered relics, carries a cost reflecting both scarcity and the charm of a bygone era. This resurgence in interest and the associated cost illuminate a deeper cultural nostalgia for the mechanical and the authentic in an age of digital sterility. Intriguingly, the typewriter ribbon's price not only pays homage to its role in literary and bureaucratic history, but also serves as a reminder of the tactile satisfaction and deliberate pace that once defined written communication, offering a poignant counterpoint to today's instantaneous digital exchanges. Beef. Flaky buttermilk biscuits are all well and good if you buy them as a snack at your local mart. But you have not tried a buttermilk biscuit until you get a veteran baker to make these for you. Who better than family? And what family member is more skilled in baking than your trusty grandmother? Well, not all of them cook or bake, but the nation has more than its fair share of grandma's creamy buttermilk recipes floating around the internet and cookbooks from dozens of years ago. Practice always makes perfect, and most home chefs learned that the great secret of an impeccable buttermilk biscuit is to not overmix so that you avoid flat and tough biscuits. These were extremely common as snacks to give to children in the family during holidays and were the perfect pairing for a gift basket. Chicken roulade came to the United States through a French cookbook called Le Cuisinier Gascon. This book has the earliest traceable recipe of the iconic chicken roulade. Yet another poultry dish, the chicken roulade is made using chicken breasts that are stuffed with various fillings like spinach, cheese, or ham. The chicken is then baked until it is ready to eat. Chicken roulade was a famous entree at restaurants back in the day until chefs started to come up with newer and improved chicken main courses. This caused traditional recipes like chicken roulade to get sidelined and eventually discontinued. It experienced a comeback in 2005 when many cooking blogs rediscovered the traditional French dish. This caused several French restaurants across the states to bring this classic food back. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing. Eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. It also made its way out to other parts of Europe, such as Denmark and Sweden, which came up with their own versions of the jelly. You won't find a lot of people talking about jellied eels now, because it has largely disappeared from the British menus. But hey, if you're ever feeling adventurous enough, I say give this one a try. During the vibrant era of the 1960s, a dollar could adorn your feet with socks, a simple yet essential wardrobe component. Socks of that era, often made from durable materials like wool and cotton, came in limited styles and colors, reflecting the practical fashion sensibilities of the time. Now, a similar purchase requires at least $5, attributing to advancements in textile technology, ethical sourcing, and a surge in consumer demand for sustainable options. This increase not only speaks to inflation but highlights a transformative shift in the textile industry towards transparency, sustainability, and ethical labor practices mirroring broader societal values. Right? Pot roasts have been as much a part of the grand scheme of American culture and cuisine as anything else on this dish, and each area, state, and neighborhood has their own ideas of what one should look like. Were you the kind of kid that grew up on beef chuck roast, potatoes, a beefy broth, and carrots in your roast? Maybe you had boneless chuck roast, olive oil, bay leaves, and stuff like that instead. These are just the few variations you can expect to find when it comes to a good, well-done pot roast. The perfect party snack or a great one to pull out for an incredibly large family dinner with the in-laws and extended family, this is one dish that never fails to pull through, especially when a seasoned cook is behind it. Another dish just as beloved as the last is sweet and sour pork. This Cantonese dish found its way into the hearts and bellies of Americans with ease in the 19th century. We have early Chinese migrants to thank for the introduction of sweet and sour pork. In America, it is a lot different than the traditional version. You would get small cubed pork alongside diced bell pepper and rice, and a lot of ketchup. This is the version that made its home in the kitchens of Americans everywhere. It exploded in popularity as a guaranteed item on the menu of mom-and-pop joints. Much like other foods on this list, sweet and sour pork faced a hiccup when it temporarily disappeared from restaurants due to the introduction of newer, fancier variations of pork. The demand for this classic dish never went down, and eventually, restaurants were inclined to bring it back. To start off, the classic roast beaver tail. Now, I know this one sounds a tad bit unusual right off the bat, but this meaty meal was once a cornerstone of survival for Native Americans and early settlers. Imagine this, trading a juicy steak for a flat, scaly beaver tail. But hey, survival is survival. They said it tasted like pork rinds, so maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Beaver tails were roasted over an open flame until the skin was crisp and the fat underneath rendered down. Beavers were a crucial resource for Native American tribes, and they didn't let any part of the rodent go to waste, not even the tails. Roast beaver tail wasn't just sustenance. It was a delicacy among American Indians and trappers. The best part? It wasn't just finger-licking delicious, but also provided a high-energy meal for those braving the frontier. Today, it's almost entirely forgotten as chicken has taken over the dinner table. Capturing life's moments on film was an affordable hobby, with $1 buying a roll of film. This practice of shooting on film created a culture of thoughtful composition and anticipation for developed pictures, distinct from today's instant digital gratification. The resurgence of analog photography, despite higher costs, reflects a nostalgia for this tangible art form and a desire for quality over quantity. The current price and popularity of film photography underline a blend of artistic appreciation and the value of physical media, showcasing the enduring allure of analog in a digital-dominated world. A lot of the recipes from the times of our parents come from the Depression and from when America was recovering from it, but things like baked ziti is what they would whip up when they had a bit of money in their pocket. Some cooked ziti, ricotta cheese, eggs, and spaghetti sauce meant for an incredibly easy and amazing pasta. If you had the Parmesan to spare, you could also sprinkle it on or add a melted layer as a topping. It did not take too long to make, and it tasted very different from regular pasta or spaghetti and meatballs, which was a recipe favored by moms more than grandmas. The real highlight of the dish is in the shape of the ziti, since they end up being these 25 to 30 centimeter tubes. When they turn into soft pasta, they become great for chewing and work really well with the cheese. Grandmas would always spice it up with some beef or duck here and there, though. We also had chicken marbella, which rivaled beef options like beef hash. Americans have always enjoyed an incredible variety of food. Popular American chefs Julie Rosso and Sheila Lukens popularized and invented chicken marbella, a dish made using chicken, prunes, olives, and capers. The recipe was first seen in the Silver Palette cookbook. The cookbook recipe was very popular in the Jewish community and quickly became popular amongst larger groups of people across America. Towards the 80s, chefs across the country decided that the chicken marbella needed a revamp. This decision would prove costly as people started disapproving of the dish when chefs added sun-dried tomatoes instead of olives. Clearly, they went a bit overboard, and people began to refrain from ordering the chicken marbella. In a frenzy, dinner joints had to remove the chicken marbella from the menu until they could go back to the original recipe. Since then, restaurants have stuck to the OG flavor more keenly. If you want to give your grandparents a rush of nostalgia, ask them about this meaty goodness, and who knows, your grandma might even dust off some cookbooks. Squirrel stew might sound unusual today, but it was a popular dish in rural areas. Yep, our bushy-tailed friends were once a common ingredient in many kitchens. Also known as Brunswick stew, it was a tomato-based stew generally involving local beans, vegetables, and originally small game meat such as squirrel. However, many variations from around the world used rabbit meat too. The origin of this meaty stew is controversial at best, as the states of Virginia and Georgia both claim its birth, with Brunswick County in Virginia and the city of Brunswick in Georgia claiming it was developed there. To keep things peaceful, let's just say Virginia and Georgia both played a role in creating this delicious stew. Squirrel meat was easily hunted and provided a necessary source of protein. With the rise of chicken, squirrel stew has fallen out of flavor. But hey, this one is pretty easy to whip up and will satisfy your Thursday night meat cravings like no other. In a bygone era, $1 could secure a sanctuary for thoughts, with pocket notebooks serving as the canvas for ideas, to-do lists, and dreams. Today, this simple tool has transformed, with premium notebooks offering a tactile reprieve from the digital deluge, at a price that underscores their newfound luxury status. This shift highlights a collective yearning for the tangible in an increasingly virtual world, with the notebook standing as a bastion of mindfulness and creativity. Remarkably, the current market for notebooks not only caters to aesthetic and functional preferences, but also echoes a larger societal reverence for the written word, advocating for a space where thoughts can flourish unfettered by screens. There are some baking challenges that only your grandmother is equipped for, and making the pinnacle of brown butter sweet potato pies was one of them. Seriously, even bakeries and fancy eateries have struggled to nail every aspect of a pie, but for most home chefs in the United States, it seems to be just another Tuesday with the oven. You take a flaky pie crust with a velvety potato filling that is usually topped off with whipped cream, but most older cooks preferred maple syrup as that was what they grew up with. Just a bit of dark brown sugar would elevate this dish into the perfect dessert, though it would often steal the show entirely on its own. The thing is built to make your mouth water, and we mean looks-wise too, since the brown and caramel hues of the pie just make it all the more enticing. Have you ever heard of this one before, and would you try it? Chicken croquettes were the heart and soul of road-stop diners everywhere. You could always stop in any state for these breaded and fried chicken patties, and they'd be served. Croquettes took off especially around the 1920s. That can explain why people may see them as old-fashioned now. Still, they have been regular for Americans for a long while. It was included in American cookbooks like The Virginia Housewife and Directions for Cookery. That is definitely a testament to its popularity. Chicken croquettes lost their popularity commercially, however, as many roadside stalls and restaurants stopped serving them. As processed and frozen food became common, the snack made a triumphant return as frozen food. Gourmet croquettes also started showing up at newer, trendy restaurants, suggesting a comeback of this beloved food to the States. Before chicken became everyone's favorite pie stuffing, rabbit pie was a favorite on the Easter table. Made out of tender rabbit meal, this savory pie was a household favorite in many rural areas. Rabbit meat is not only rich in flavor, but it's full of nutrients, which made this a healthy choice for many and a staple of the American pioneers. Plus, rabbit meat didn't cost a fortune like most meat back in the day and was widely available. Along with rabbit meat, ingredients of the filling of a rabbit pie typically included onions, celery, and carrots. Some English variations included prunes, bacon, and cider, while the Australians sometimes included the food paste Vegemite. $1 in the 60s could guarantee a clean shave for weeks, a testament to the era's straightforward approach to grooming. In the labyrinth of modern grooming, the simple razor blade has evolved into a symbol of sophistication and personal care, with prices reflecting technological advancements and a bespoke shaving experience. This escalation in cost not just delineates inflation, but underscores a shift towards luxury in personal grooming, where the ritual of shaving marries innovation with tradition. It's noteworthy that today's razor blades, often part of subscription models, reflect a broader trend in consumer goods towards customization and quality, ensuring that even the most mundane daily routines are infused with a sense of indulgence and personal choice. Here is a dish that you have probably heard of one too many times but never gotten enough of: meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Let's just say that comfort cooking really does not get much higher than this, nor more relaxing. Sitcoms, movies, and comedies across the decades that depict middle-class families always have somebody serving up a killer meatloaf, and it is for good reason. Our generation's parents always grew up eating a hearty meatloaf with a side of perfectly mushy soft potatoes, so it is no wonder that they kept the custom going. Today, mashed potatoes have an 85% popularity rate, which even beats hamburgers and cheeseburgers. You would think that those would be America's top one, but it seems nothing can beat Grand's meatloaf classics. In the vibrant 1960s, a solitary dollar could dress you in dreams, purchasing a yard of fabric for your latest fashion escapade. Today, that same dollar barely brushes the price tag of quality fabric, reflecting not merely inflation, but a revolution in textile production and ethics. This surge in cost encapsulates the shift towards sustainable materials and fair labor practices, heralding a new era where fashion intertwines with activism. Interestingly, the fabric's journey from a mere commodity to a statement of values underscores the industry's pivotal role in the environmental and ethical awakening. It's a testament to how consumer advocacy has reshaped market offerings, ensuring that behind every price tag lies a story of ecological stewardship and social responsibility. Sandwiches have always had an iconic space in American cuisines. The grilled cheese sandwich is especially iconic given the status it holds for being the best lunch snack. Kraft Foods profited off this love for grilled cheese and created Cheese Whiz on everything. This thin cheese spread quickly became the main ingredient in creating the perfect cheese sandwich. Dairy products like fresh cheese had a low shelf life as compared to the cheese spread. This prompted people to buy Cheese Whiz. In the 70s, the spread reached peak popularity amongst masses. This was until the original flavor was discontinued. The reason was simple. Kraft Foods wanted to improve their product to cater to a wider audience. They hoped by improving their original recipe, Cheese Whiz would be consumed by locals and gourmet chefs alike. The product came back onto the shelf pretty soon with a new formula. Today, the spread can be seen in homes and restaurants to create gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, Beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. No longer just an afterthought, the humble stick of deodorant has undergone a transformation, morphing into a product deeply intertwined with discussions of health, sustainability, and ethics. Once a straightforward purchase, today's deodorant comes with options free from aluminum, parabens, and synthetic fragrances, catering to a consumer base increasingly concerned with what goes on and in their bodies. This pivot in the deodorant market is not just a matter of changing consumer preferences, but a reflection of a broader societal shift towards transparency and safety in personal care products. Impressively, the price tags on these new-age deodorants speak to the investment in research and development required to provide alternatives that are both effective and align with the ethical standards demanded by today's informed consumer. Now, mashed potatoes and gravy need no introduction or explanation. Everyone and their mother's mother has had it. But did you know how good they were at making it? Receiving this dish from the chefs of generations ago was an entirely different experience in comfort. We do not know what spices they would mix, as each area had its own variations, with some even using mushrooms. Most popular was coriander, thyme, black pepper, and some oregano. The gravy would even put KFC to shame, if we are being completely honest. You just did not feel like eating from the outside when you had such fine dining available at home, and it was the perfect thing to get you back up only our feet from an exhausting day. For a change of pace, let us look at dishes that were less traditional. Salmon patties were a budget-friendly fish cake that emerged when budget food was in high demand. Let us set the scene. It is the Great Depression. People are hungry and many are sick. Poultry like chicken and beef was priced unbelievably. The canned salmon and salmon patties were brought in by the government to help as a last resort. This resort was quite successful as people fell in love with the delicious salmon patties. The patties had their peak in popularity in the Great Depression era, and past that, they faded out of memory as economic capacities settled. While the affordable can never came back, chefs created salmon patties inspired by the original taste. Today, you can find these patties being made with high-quality salmon and modern seasonings. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. A dollar once unfurled into countless cups of tea, a simple pleasure steeped in tradition. As the tea leaves have turned, so too have consumer palates, with today's enthusiasts savoring specialty blends that command a heftier sum. This evolution from staple to luxury captures a cultural infusion of global tastes and a growing emphasis on health and sustainability. Importantly, the rise in specialty tea prices reflects not just a quest for quality, but a burgeoning awareness of tea's journey from leaf to cup, spotlighting the ethical considerations and artisanal craftsmanship that enrich each sip. It's a brew that tells of globalization's impact on our dining tables, inviting a deeper appreciation of the world in every cup. Beef stew is a nostalgic childhood dish nobody can go without. Fresh pearl onions and a broth made out of the beef stock were the tricks to an unbeatable stew that is sorely missed every time you eat one that is not your grandma's. The modern-day beef stew involves an entire list of 10 ingredients for better readability that feels more like an overdone broth mixed with a lot of toppings. But that is because beef stews have gone a bit out of fashion unless you are in the South. This is also because beef stews today are usually made with red wine as a base. But the hearty and vigor-filled ones of your childhood were all about keeping it simple with vegetables and a solid cut of beef. Initially, $1 under the National School Lunch Program could extend to cover a week's worth of nutritious meals for children, illustrating the government's role in ensuring no child went hungry. These meals, often simple but balanced, were crucial for many families, providing children with consistent, healthy food during the school day. Today, that dollar might only cover a single meal, reflecting advancements in nutritional standards and the increasing complexity of dietary requirements. The evolution of the program, from basic sustenance to a comprehensive nutrition initiative, underscores the growing emphasis on healthy eating habits and the educational system's role in promoting them amidst broader economic challenges. Now that's some character development for foods that once were served to poor people to now the best delicacies we know. Comment which food was your favorite, and don't forget to like and subscribe.